Final Fantasy XVI is shaping up to be an incredible game. I just finished the demo and can proudly say it's the most I've ever been engaged by a Square Enix game's opening hours. Although way too much of it was a cutscene, the hard part is probably over. Final Fantasy XVI is taking the franchise in a brand new direction in every way. A new combat style, one playable character, kaiju quick time events, boss fights, and it got me thinking, no other Final Fantasy has ever changed up the formula this much. Every one of them still feels like Final Fantasy at its core, except this one. So why is Square Enix trying to take this legendary franchise in a brand new direction? Well, I have a theory, and I'm a little troubled by it. Square Enix might be trying to say this is what Final Fantasy will be going forward. It's a gritty, cutscene-heavy action game. I think they might be trying to kill the JRPG genre once and for all. Now, Final Fantasy has always been an anthology. It's what makes the franchise so accessible, so it's entirely possible that I'm wrong and this is just the furthest out they've ever gone, but I think if Final Fantasy XVI sells really well, we'll definitely be seeing this as the new normal, and that's what Square Enix is hoping for. So here's all the evidence I have that Square Enix is presenting Final Fantasy XVI not just as a new installment, but as a reboot of the franchise. The first clue is the release timing. When compared to Final Fantasy XV, 7 years is the longest we've ever gone without a mainline Final Fantasy. While a lot of this can be attributed towards the industry's downward spiral to more extensive and more bloated games, we can also deduce that Square Enix spent a lot of time rethinking what Final Fantasy is, and how they can alter it so that it can suit a modern audience. The streamlining of mechanics makes Final Fantasy XVI the most accessible game to date, so Square Enix is trying to communicate that if you're on the fence, now is the time to jump on. The second clue is the setting of the game. It has been a long while since we've had a straight sword and sorcery Final Fantasy. I thought the franchise had evolved past this, giving Final Fantasy this unique blend of sci-fi and fantasy that made each game distinct in its own way. So a played straight medieval Final Fantasy feels like a return to the original setting, like a new beginning, or a reboot. The next point is what's been removed from Final Fantasy at this point in time. There are no mini-games or airships or anything light-hearted. While these aren't the things that make or break a Final Fantasy, they're almost a tradition at this point, and to watch them being removed indicates that the franchise is changing. My last and most shaky point is what number Final Fantasy this is. If we were talking about Final Fantasy XVIII, I wouldn't even be considering writing this essay. But 16 is a clean break of a number. It's the next number following a multiple of 5, so it's a nice place to sort of split the franchise down the middle. So there's all my evidence that Final Fantasy might be trying to reboot in this latest entry, and I'd like to explore if that's a bad thing. Many franchises in recent years have left their origins behind and evolved into even greater things than what they originally were. God of War and Monster Hunter found more success than they'd ever had before by appealing to a more casual audience, but can the same really be said for Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy I set the tone for the entire franchise, a game presented in a light-hearted style with cheery visuals that ended in a cosmological horror and tackled heavy themes through its story, and that was built upon by every Final Fantasy after that. Final Fantasy XVI looks to be throwing all that out and establishing a new tone. We certainly haven't seen the last sci-fi Final Fantasy, but I'm wondering if we've seen the last mainline entry with a cheery tone. Final Fantasy has always blended the silly and serious ideally. Dragon Quest is what happens when you get too silly, and Kingdom Hearts is what happens when you take yourself too seriously, and there's a reason Final Fantasy has outsold both of those franchises. Final Fantasy XVI will no doubt be a high-quality game, but I think the commercial and critical success of this game could have more of an impact on the RPG genre as a whole than any other game in history.